look over here. Is there any questions from Goldberg? Campbell? Supervisor Campbell? Several questions? Okay. Let's start with Supervisor Half. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to clarify, I think you stated it, but I just want to clarify that we're required to do this partly because of SB 32. Is that accurate? An accurate statement?
Yes, and the general plan went through the CEQA, or the environmental review process. One of the questions that we're required to look at is, was the general plan consistent with SB 32? And so in order to provide that consistency, a climate action plan was the recommended mitigation measure. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so just to be clear on that, SB 32 doesn't explicitly require climate action plans per se, but our general plan to ensure consistency with SB 32 included that requirement.
And that's where we get the emission standards as far as what we have to reduce by a certain time? Like there's targets of 2030 and 2050.
Those targets came from SB 32.
Okay.
And if I could add to that too, SB 32 and also Executive Order S-3-05, it's a 2005 Executive Order that was required to be considered in the Climate Action Plan as well.
So those are governor's executive orders?
The second one is SB 32 is a Senate bill.
No, the EOs.
Yes.
Yeah. And so how exactly were the greenhouse gas emissions calculated for Tuolumne County?
That is a great question, and I'm going to switch over to Zoom if Heather can help me, and we'll bring in our two consultants from Ascent, Hannah and Honey, and they can elaborate on how the emissions inventory was done.
Yeah, thanks, Quincy. Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Hannah Kornfeld with Ascent to putting the climate action plan together. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we followed standard protocols that are used for doing such inventories for local agencies. So in this instance, we use the U.S. Community Protocol, which is recommended by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, as well as the California Air Resources Board.
Okay, so I have another question based upon your answer. And this would be specifically since a majority of our emissions seem to come from, where is that slide?
I can put it back up.
62%, where is that slide? Of the road on-road transportation. How is it delineated? Because, you know, the air doesn't stop at our borders. How is it calculated, the emissions from on-road vehicles? Because we all know that emissions from the Bay Area and from the Valley flow east, and they come to us. So they're not necessarily all from Tuolumne County. So this is a conundrum to me, and I'd like you to explain it in very layman's terms so we all understand it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
The on-road transportation emissions are based on the amount of vehicle trips taken in Tuolumne County. So this does not look at trips that are being taken that pass through Tuolumne County. So we look at three different types of trips. Trips that begin and end within the county's borders, trips that begin outside the county but end inside the county. We take 50% of those trips. And then trips that start inside the county and end outside the county, we take 50% of those trips. This methodology is recommended by the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research as well. So this is traditional ways to account for vehicle miles traveled. It does not look at someone traveling all the way through Tuolumne County. Those trips and the emissions associated with those trips would not be attributed to Tuolumne County. The vehicle miles traveled that we looked at is consistent with what TCTC was able to provide us with, and we checked the methodology with them.
And Supervisor Half, I think the other question, and Hannah, maybe you can talk about this, is maybe what you're also talking about is just the ambient air quality in Tuolumne County, where there's ambient levels that either are a result of emissions that happen in the county versus emissions that happen outside the county. And is that what you're asking about?
Yes, and because it was stated that the U.S. Community Protocol was used and the Air Quality Control Board. So the Air Quality Control Board tells me that they're measuring the air quality also in order to come up with the standards. So it's confusing to me.
Yeah, sure. So Hannah, can you talk about the difference between air quality and the number and like emissions, an emissions inventory? Because I think that we want to clarify that those are two different things.
Okay.
Sure. Yes. So air quality is looking more at the pollutants that are not associated with generating the greenhouse gas effect. So the only pollutants that we look at for the climate action plan are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So things like ROG and NOx that form ozone or particulate matter that's generated by burning diesel, those are air pollutants. Those are addressed differently and separately from a climate action plan. And that's primarily what the goal of a local air pollution control district is responsible for, is dealing with those types of pollutants separate from greenhouse gas emissions.
So I think to summarize, Supervisor Half, is that you're acknowledging an existing fact that we have air quality levels, good or bad, and those result from both internal boundary generation or external flows. This report is really looking at GHG, the creation of GHGs within the county and breaking those down by sector. So it's not saying that there isn't air quality issues, or there may be air quality issues from, migrating pollutants. It's just looking at a part of it, and it's looking at the part of it that's generated within the county boundaries.
Okay, that's helpful. And you had stated when you brought up, Quincy, when you brought up slide 7, that there are no costs included in the climate action plan, and I didn't quite get why there were not.
Sure. Hannah, do you want to talk a little bit about what type of, because I also did talk a little bit that there were some qualitative costs that were used in the scoring criteria. So Hannah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not typical in a long-term planning effort like a climate action plan to estimate the exact cost to implement that action because there are so many actions included in the climate action plan. This is really similar to the county's general plan. So there were a lot of implementation programs identified in the county's general plan, and there were not anticipated costs associated with implementing those. For the purpose of the prioritization matrix that's included in Appendix C, which is how we got that narrowed down list that we included in the implementation chapter of the CAP, we looked at whether the overall estimated cost could outweigh the benefits or vice versa. So really we're thinking about if you're going to increase the amount of energy efficiency, the ability for a building to be more energy efficient, there might be upfront cost to that, but a lot of studies have shown that in the long term, you're going to see a financial payback because you have reduced your energy costs. So those were the types of qualitative things that we were taking into consideration, but we don't have specific estimates for what the upfront cost of each measure is, as well as what is the estimated payback and what is the payback period. That would have to be done under a separate effort, and that would look at probably the near-term actions that the climate action plan identified, and really thinking through the staffing capacity for implementing that, as well as, maybe there are grant opportunities or other funding opportunities available to assist the county with implementation.
Okay, and then I think my last question involves slide 13, and I assume from all the dialogue we had about it, that is a graph that is just for California. It doesn't break it down to Tuolumne County. I was surprised to see a very low bar for the year 2013 when we had the rim fire. I mean, that was a big fire. And so I guess I don't know what. Can you? I know you explained it, Quincy, and I'm feeling really dense here, but I'm not understanding what this graph is even saying at this point.
Okay, so this graph is coming out of this document, which came from the California Air Resources Board. Public comment draft, greenhouse gas emissions of contemporary wildfire, prescribed fire, and forest management activities. So as I said, the draft came out in 2020, and they haven't published a final draft yet, so they're way behind. Okay.
Could we share the graph again?
Yeah, sure, I've got it up. Heather, if you want to share my screen.
It's 13.
Okay, so I really chose this graph as a placeholder so that we could talk about emissions. So this is just one graph I pulled from that report to just show that there are emissions to greenhouse gas emissions from wildfire. And it's just a way to show you that that has changed over time. I reused this slide to just make sure that the public and the board understands that there are emissions from greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm not trying to say that there aren't.
Right.
It's just that we're not including them in the report, and I've outlined those reasons.
Yeah.
So those emissions do exist. They can be fairly large. Right now, there's not a way for me to identify the GHG emissions from wildfires that happen in Tuolumne County. So for the purpose of this report, those emissions aren't helpful to me. To the overall scope of climate change and what we can do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from wildfire, those emissions are important, but on a much bigger scale than Tuolumne County. And our document does address forest resiliency, which will contribute to our emissions within our boundary that then can be consolidated, can be incorporated, can be all of those things munched together, smushed together with emissions from California.
All right. Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm hoping that, I'm no biologist, but it seems like maybe I have a very simplistic view of this, and now I'm starting to make comments, so I won't go there right now.
Don't force me to talk about the carbon cycle, but basically all I can tell you is that there's emissions that we're going to get from GHGs, burning in wildfires. We're going to get them from anthropomorphic sources.
I'm going to end right there, but I do want to say that forest fires know no boundaries, just like
100%.
Car emissions know no boundaries, and so the fire doesn't have to happen here in Tuolumne County for it to affect us. But that's not a question, so I'm done.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Supervisor Brandon.
Great, thank you. So since we had discussed this, I think, last time at the board, there's just been a number of changes. I mean, there's a lot of grant funding that's out there. There's a lot of regional planning that's happening. I'm wondering how, throughout the process, some of these might be interacting with this draft. So specifically, SURF funding, hydrogen hub, water projects, and water advocacy.
So Supervisor Brandon, the question is, how can this document specifically address those types of funding sources?
Or have they, since those have come about after we initiated all of this, were those incorporated to try, and so we passed this, we end up trying to give ourselves the best hand to be able to get some of these grant funds for, say, forest resilience projects and for bringing in an alternative power station or green hydrogen hub or something like that.
Right. So thanks for the question. So I can't speak specifically. The climate action plan would be tailored to a specific grant opportunity, but having this will put the county in a position to apply for those grants. Mm-hmm. We did have a situation that came up with OES and with Dory Beats where that was related to a CAL FIRE scoring system, and one of the components was having an adopted climate action plan. I think it got us on a communities list. I don't remember. We talked about it was like 8 months ago. We talked about it at your board, and one of those things to be on this identified list for funding was to have a climate action plan. So I don't know specifically, Supervisor Brandon, of which opportunities would be available to us.
No, I understand there may be, for lack of a better way, boxes to check and some of that to be able to give us a better hand. What I wanted to ask is if we've specifically looked at some of these new programs and tried to tailor this to that, or whether we've just kind of continued with, the initial direction.
I have not looked at any specific programs to ensure that the document's tailored to it.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Thank you. I wanted to ask, too, there was the list of the counties that have adopted this, and I was just kind of looking through, and thank you for including that, too. Some of them did seem to be just straight up climate action plans. Other ones were a little bit different, and they were, say, more economic development oriented, or it was a climate and recreation plan. Do we know, I guess in looking at that, and I didn't look up every single one, are there other alternatives? When we had first had the presentation, I think it was to create a climate action plan, but then looking at Mariposa, for example, and how they're using that for recreational economic development, that there are other options there that are kind of in addition to the climate elements. You know, same data, but targeting it at another problem.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to understand the question exactly, but I can maybe. So part of this process, I did meet with the Visitors Bureau, and we talked extensively about climate change, catastrophic wildfires, extreme weather, and how that does impact the county's economy, and our recreational opportunities. So I would imagine that that there are measures in the plan, both in Appendix C, and that some may have been carried over into our work plan that would address recreation in a way that would help maybe push it to the top of the list, if that's what you're asking. I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
and that wasn't a clear question. I guess I was wondering, you know, from some of these other models, what other climate action plans, what they've adopted as kind of joint elements to it. I was looking specifically for that. We had the conservation recreation element in our measures, and I believe most of the recreation ones hadn't hit the 15 point. It seems like most of those had been removed with it. And a lot of the economic development ones might not be in there anymore because they were kind of not trying to solve a greenhouse gas emission goal. They were trying to use that to solve a economic development goal.
Sure. I'm going to see if Hannah can help me answer this.
Okay.
She's
Sure.
yeah. Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, absolutely. So climate action plans can take a variety of forms. Sometimes they're not called climate action plans, but they serve similar intents. So, for example, Placer County released a sustainability plan that they adopted fairly recently. I believe actually Supervisor Half had asked us to take a look at that plan to see if we were proposing similar policies and measures. And we were across the board doing the same types of approach. We were conducting our greenhouse gas emissions analysis in the same manner. Placer County opted to call theirs a sustainability plan because of the funding from PG&E that supported the energy action plans that were carried out by the Sierra Business Council. Those really were focused on energy efficiency and clean energy. So that's why those were called energy efficiency plans. I think Mono County is a resource efficiency plan. So they take a lot of different forms, and that really depends on what the community is prioritizing. For the purposes of Tuolumne County, because this was called out in the general plan as developing a climate action plan, that's the name that county staff and that we kind of carried forward. But we did look at all these other co-benefits of, benefits to economic development, job creation, local jobs, things like that. But it just was not the focus because we were trying to meet other objectives at the same time.
And I would just add those objectives, thanks Hannah for pulling it back, is that the objectives really did come from the implementation program in the general plan. So that was, when we set out, that was the focus of the plan the entire time.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that because I kind of wanted to reconcile some of the flexibility I was seeing with other counties with kind of what we were focusing on targeting. I also wanted to ask in particular how this may affect our housing or population or industry coming in. I think the idea behind it, and this is kind of similar to the comment I made in the document on water, our net water usage would go up if we were able to house more people. But that's a good thing if we're able to put more people in homes. The goal of it should be per capita efficiency. And so I'm wondering if implementing something like this, and this may just be a question about AB 32, are we in some way putting more of a cap on say, how many homes that we could build or how much economic development we could be able to do? Is it per capita or is it a total amount?
Sure.
I'm all for efficient buildings. I don't want us to say, we can't grow beyond 55,000 people. Some probably want that, but I'd like to see more housing.
Hannah, can you talk about housing, water use, and maybe qualified versus non-qualified cap and the CEQA process in answering that question, maybe?
Yes, I will try to touch on all of this. So
Okay.
in terms of how the climate action plan was developed, so the cap itself is not a growth-inducing document. What we use to conduct the greenhouse gas forecasts or the projections that we expect over the coming decades is based on the growth included in the general plan. So has not changed. The climate action plan does not change any growth projections. It does not limit growth in any way. It says this is how Tuolumne County is expecting to grow. Therefore, this is what we expect the emissions to be. And that future baseline is what we're trying to reduce emissions from. So it is not intended to hinder growth by any means. I think Supervisor Brandon, when we talked about really having more per capita goals, because that really should be the intent, is more efficiency, but we're not going to limit the amount of water being consumed, for example. So the intent is not to make it more difficult to build in Tuolumne County, and we can talk more about the implications of new development and what they would be held to in terms of complying with the climate action plan. This is not a CEQA qualified cap, so it does not dictate what new development needs to do, but instead all new development coming through for county approval would need to show that it is consistent with the climate action plan, and if it could not demonstrate that, then it would need to show alternative mitigation measures that would achieve comparable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, and then a question for Director Yaley. I wanted to ask about our growth projections. Is that still operating under the 80-something thousand growth projection, or is that a little bit more reasonable now with the population?
80,000?
Yeah.
So the general plan that was adopted in 2019,
Yeah.
the growth projection that I think it was 80, 84 something, and that was in the 1996 general plan. The 2018 general plan is now I'll look it up, but it's more like 52, 54, 56, somewhere in the mid 50s in terms of that growth projection. It was like might be 64. I can't tell you off the top of my head actually now that I think about it, but I can look it up for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. And so I guess in looking at the projects, if we've already hit that population amount for the growth projection, and we're looking at projects coming in to reduce it below that amount, wouldn't they have to effectively have a negative impact? I don't know. Maybe I'm not understanding that.
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So if we're setting our population at, say, 55,000, we hit 55,000 basically right now, very close to it, and new projects come in and our population grows beyond that, are we then, for them to meet that goal, they would have to have a negative impact on total emissions, not just be efficient, but,
So the question is, if we grow beyond what the general plan says, and
our growth projections so low that implementing this would mean that we can't do projects because they would have to, for example, not just be energy efficient, but add energy back to the grid because we're already at our growth projection if we're at like 53,000.
So
sorry, is that clear? I know that's kind of a convoluted question, but
so the question is, if in the future the county was to grow so much, and then we got another project that put that where we were over our efficiency thresholds, would that project have to do more than what a project today would need to do?
yes.
Okay, so Hannah, I'm going to cue you for this, but really at that time we'd be looking at like our baseline environmental conditions under the California Environmental Quality Act, and so every project's going to be measured against a baseline,
Okay, so we'd have to reevaluate the growth projections then.
Hannah, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so that would mean that the climate action plan is now out of date. So the cap, again, is not going to prohibit growth. It's not going to limit growth. It's simply trying to manage based on the growth expected. How can that growth be more sustainable? So if the county had achieved what it considered its general plan build out, decades in advance, then that just means that the climate action plan's greenhouse gas inventory and forecasts are now out of date, and would need to be updated, and therefore new efficiency thresholds could be derived. The efficiency thresholds that are included in the climate action plan are not going to be adopted. So those are still just guidance, and those are not required by any new development to follow, but they do provide a pathway to demonstrate consistency.
Okay. I also want to ask about the 15-point threshold that was kind of established. How was that established? I mean, looking through the initial Appendix C, there's a ton of stuff that didn't make the cut there. That probably did have a much lower impact based on that rating, but maybe it was something that, good or bad. How was 15 established?
Hannah, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so 15 in a lot of ways is a little bit arbitrary. Really what we did was we scored everything, and then we looked at, okay, how many measures would the county staff really be able to implement? And we did not want to create this laundry list. That was the intent of the prioritization matrix. Is there's, over 100 actions identified in the climate action plan, but what is the really impactful subset that the county should focus on first? And so when we had spoken with county staff, we decided, okay, what is a reasonable number of actions to take in the next few years? And we had determined somewhere, I think, between 20 and 30 actions would be sufficient, and that would be doable. I think that number, the reason I'm not remembering exactly is I know we added some actions after the draft cap was released. So 15 ended up being the threshold that made the most sense in terms of having then a certain set of actions that could be implemented by the county without it feeling too overwhelming.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thank you for the answer on that. I think that is all the questions I have.
All right, my turn. I have a lot of questions. These are all my sticky notes. This is it again. But I think what I want to do is just ask a couple questions, hear from the public, hear from the rest of our board, because what I don't want to do is waste everybody's time with questions if something goes a certain way. So I just want to start off with this. When I look at Appendix E, which talks about, we did the community outreach, which it basically came down to wildfire and drought. That was the community's number one concern. And I wrote down here, I cut part of it out. It says there's lots of discussion about catastrophic wildfires are becoming increasingly frequent and emit large amounts of carbon. Yet in the cap, there's no reference to scientific data referred to about forest management and or CO2 emissions from wildfires. Basically, it just puts the blame on climate change. So what we're kind of being looked at, what we're looking at today when we're adopting the CAP, there's a prioritization matrix. And what's hard for me to move forward as a policymaker is if we do the outreach to the public, and their other concern was water, because of drought and whatnot and water storage. So you got fire and water are the two number one concerns. As a policy decision, if we have this matrix, but yet the two number one concerns of our community aren't included in that matrix, and there's no way to really score that and really put any additional, I guess you could say, action items on that. It's hard for me to understand maybe why we did the public outreach when we're not going to include basically our constituents' number one concerns. So I guess my question would be, again, we're not calculating the data, and yet the state's coming out saying that someday in the future we will. I'm trying to understand why. Would we be violating like the CAP if we tried to include that data? I understand that obviously the state's not requiring it, but what's the harm in maybe including it, getting some of that information, and then putting it in the CAP and then scoring it in the matrix?
I have some thoughts on that, but I'm going to turn it to Hannah first. So what I'm here, if I can restate the question, tell me if I got it right, is that the community surveys indicated, drought and wildfire as their top concerns. Why aren't there more action items in the prioritization matrix addressing those two concerns. I think I heard that. And then I also think I heard, why can't we just put data, I'm guessing from wildfire emissions, into our report if we wanted to, even though the state may not have that? Is that the
Sure, because I mean, when you look at Governor Newsom's statements that we live in wildfire, get used to it, people. We're going to continue. I mean, basically, he's come out and said, get used to it, California. California's going to keep burning. And then I read the 10-year plan from the U.S. Forest Service, which basically kind of dittos the same thing, which was, yeah, things are going to keep burning. So as a policy, when I know that our government and that these decisions are being made at a high level, that there's going to continue to be fires, and yet we're not going to pay attention to those CO2 emissions. Then, and what's crazy, Quincy, what's crazy is I did a little bit of research, and I guess that Dale guy who's running for governor, he proposed SB 495. So back in 2020, he said here the 2020 fire season, an estimated 4.3 million acres burned, the most since record keeping began. These forest fires emit more carbon emissions than all the cars on the road for an entire year. Sadly, those emissions are not included by the state in their scoping plan. The legislature voted down Bill SB 495 that sought to smartly update California Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006 to require the California Air Resources Board to count emissions from wildfires into its pollution scoping plan. So when I know that our state is withholding or voted no on a piece of legislation that would, because there is the ability to count those emissions, and yet we are making a choice to turn the blind eye and say we're not going to pay attention to that. We're going to pay attention. And I get the whole fossil fuel things, right? Because when we talk about fuels, or not fossil fuels, when we talk about the natural, evolution of fire, fires burn and then ash, and then there's reforestation and grows, like there's that carbon cycle, right? It's natural. It's a natural process. That's the easiest solution to explain it. And then you have fossil fuels, which is cars and buildings. And so what they're trying to do, I get it, is they're trying to say, let's lessen this because this is a natural cycle. But as a policymaker, if I can help influence that natural cycle and keep those levels down, why not? You know what I mean? So I'm struggling as a policymaker to, when I know that we're not going to pay attention to that, but yet we're going to focus in on this when this is quickly going to become over the next decade, increasingly, I mean, the number said 2,100. By 2,100, we plan on tripling or quadrupling the amount of forest that burns in Tuolumne County. It's quickly going to become much more of an issue than the cars that we're driving. So I would like to, as a policymaker, include fire, include some of that data, include maybe some more data on water specifically, and put it in the matrix and prioritize it. So I'm kind of going into comments now, which you kind of hear where I'm headed, and I'll make that motion later, but I want to hear from the public. But I guess that's my question is, can we, let me help. Can we, I know there's data out there. Can we not go after and get it and include it in this and prioritize it in the matrix?
Okay, so
and see where it falls in the matrix?
Sure. So I heard your clarifying questions were, why didn't water and forest, if those were the top concerns, make the prioritization matrix? So let's talk about those first, if that's okay. So part of the scoring process is looking at what jurisdiction does the county have. And so the county doesn't have control over the water in Tuolumne County. So that's a reason why those measures, even though it's a big concern from the public, that we're not saying that it's not important. We're just saying from a scoring perspective and what the county staff can work on first, those fell lower. Same thing with wildfire. We've addressed it through forest resiliency, and we've recognized the work that the county's already doing. That is in the prioritization matrix. So Hannah, can you talk a little bit more specifically about the question being that if wildfire and drought are the public's biggest concerns, how do those translate, or why was there a lack of translation into the work plan?
Yeah, I think, Quincy, you're hitting on the main points, which is what does the county have direct authority over? I think that what we found and in doing all of this engagement was that, TUD and other agencies are really the ones that are driving the change, and the county should play a supporting role for a lot of these instances. There was no intent of not scoring those because that's not what we heard from the public. we certainly did not start with this kind of resiliency lens to the project, because the intent really was to address greenhouse gas emissions. And this came to the forefront, and we pivoted several times during the project to really hear from the community and dig more into these issue areas. But really it was about kind of what was supposed to be included in this climate action plan based on the general plan mitigation measure language. And that's really what we included. So wildfire emissions was not identified in that mitigation measure. It was not included in Ascent's scope of work. And while there is data out there on some of this information, fire models are still very nascent. It's really hard to get accurate data, and it certainly is possible, but there are no protocols out there at a community-wide level that we could rely on and say with really any degree of certainty, this is what we expect wildfire emissions to be in the past, present, or future.
And I would add to that, Hannah, that you could look at it in a way that if a measure didn't score high enough because of, let's just say, a jurisdictional authority issue that the county had, we have developed a work plan for many other entities within the county to use. And so there's nothing to say that a water entity such as TUD or GCSD couldn't pick up some of those other measures that we've outlined in Appendix C and pick those up and start working on those. So it's available for, and we did have TUD participation. We had participation from our tribes, some of our GCSD, some of our other service providers. So I would just add that.
Okay. All right. Like I said, I have lots of other questions, but I want to hear from the public first and then hear, from more of the board on their comments. So I will keep it at that. So with that being said, unless there's any additional questions, we've all had our opportunity. I'm going to open it up to public comment. So if there's any public comment in the room.